This is Trench Diaries. Overlord. Utah Beach. Part 4. Gefreiter Stefan Heinwetz. I was able to take hold of the armor skirting and clamber onto the back of the vehicle, which was extremely hot due to the engine vents. I held on there, and the Stug reversed back from the road, pushing aside many of the wrecked transports, and moved to the south, away from these bunkers. I took a look along the side of the Stug as I held on, and saw that there were 3 Shermans now apparently disabled in the road, the 2 we had hit with the rockets, and another which was also on fire and standing in the flood water. There were other tanks behind these 3, and infantry moving around between them, but the immobilized Shermans were obstructing their progress. In this manner, we withdrew from the line of bunkers and used a forest track to retreat several kilometers to the southeast, where a number of armored vehicles were assembling into a small battle group in the woods. This force was not impressive, to be frank. They were from an armored division to the south of the sector. There were several Stugs, several of the large armored cars and some infantry and Hanomags. Maybe 10 vehicles in all and 30 infantry. That is probably about all. The vehicles were heavily disguised with foliage on their superstructures, but even so, the crews were reluctant to move them out of the woods. We could see and hear the Allied airplanes overhead, swarming across the countryside at low altitude, and there was no mobile flak gun in this group. Also, the command situation appeared to be confused. I fell into conversation with the Panzergrenadier men, and their view was that the divisional commanders were slow in responding to the attack. We all used the word attack at this stage. It was only later in the day that the word invasion was used more widely. Unfortunately, this was not the end of my combat experience on June 6. At this point, which was late in the morning, there was a lull in the fighting between the 2 sides. Possibly the Americans were concentrating on building up forces from their sea vessels into their land pocket. Certainly, the German troops used the time to organize themselves and to bring up more vehicles and troops. This lasted an hour or so, certainly less than 2 hours, but all the time the Allied aircraft were moving overhead and firing into the German area of operations. As I had no trace of my unit from the original bunker, I attached myself to these Panzergrenadiers. I received medical attention from their medics, and they gave me another amphetamine tablet, which boosted my energy and my frame of mind greatly. I was armed with the MP40 I had picked up, and I obtained more magazines and grenades from these men. These troops were mostly very young men with older Feldwebel commanders. They had not yet been in contact with the Americans, and they were eager to engage them. There was also a field kitchen which gave me soup, bread and boiled sweets. I was desperately hungry, and I ate all they could give me while sitting on an ammunition crate under a tree, with those thunderbolts flying back and forth overhead. There also came into the woods a unit of SS infantry. This was a platoon of about 20 youths who were extremely young, about 17, and they had been cut off from their commanders by aircraft attack on a road to the south. They were very heavily armed, with MG-34 and MP-40, and these weapons looked out of place alongside their boyish faces. So all these troops and vehicles were packed together in the woods without clear leadership and unwilling to move outside because of air attacks. 2 of the armored cars went out to do reconnaissance of the American positions and intending to take prisoners for interrogation. These armored cars did not return. The level of explosions and firing began to increase again after the late morning lull. Going to the west side of the woods, we could see smoke and flashes in the farmland on that side, where the land was higher and not flooded. All of this led to a great concern that we were being outflanked and isolated. In the end, after about midday, the Stug commanders finally received orders from their divisional command. They were to fall back to a fortified line about 2 kilometers south, where there were German pack guns and emplacements. That line was to be held at all costs until more reinforcements arrived. We began to form up into a column to retreat to this new line. The road to the south was a route I did not know personally. It was a dirt track suitable for farm tractors and so on, but it was partially sunken below ground level and screened to the north and west by a thick hedgerow of the type the French called bocage. These low roads with hedge screens are typical of the Normandy and Brittany countryside. The fields to either side were believed to be mined. This was quite a strong route for a retreat, and we began to move out along it with the armored cars first, then Hanomags with their infantry on board in the vanguard, then the SS infantry on foot and the 3 Stugs in the rear. The rearmost Stug faced backward and moved in reverse gear behind the whole column, with its gun pointing towards the enemy. Because of the narrow road and the number of tight bends, the vehicles could only proceed at walking pace. The Stug crews told me this might actually be a benefit, because the vehicles were covered with so much foliage that they might look like part of the hedgerow from the air, and moving at speed would destroy this illusion. The soldier's mind finds so many hopes to cling on to in a retreat. Because of my leg injury, I took up a position on one of the Stugs, crouching among all the branches and leaves on the rear hull. The road became increasingly sunken below the countryside, until the top of the Stug was barely level with the surrounding land. This was excellent for concealment, but of course it also meant that the vehicles could not move off the road for any reason. I heard the Stug commander say that if any vehicle broke down, the Stugs would have to run over it and continue moving. The mood was very tense. It was hot and humid and nobody knew how close the Americans might be, whether the airborne troops or the beach forces. There were parachutes visible on the ground beside the road at some points, and we saw several American paratroopers who appeared to be dead, still hanging from their parachutes in the trees beyond the fields. One thing that we saw on that first stage of the retreat disturbed me. We slowly rounded a curve in the track, shielded by the hedgerow, and plainly visible along the top of the embankment were several dead American troops. They were in a kneeling position with their hands behind their backs, and it seemed they had been shot methodically, then simply left where they kneeled. The crew of the Stug that I was riding on commented that this must be the work of the SS boys, who apparently had a taste for such things. It concerned me greatly that these Americans, who seemed to be airborne troops, had been captured and deliberately executed in such a way. I never learned who was responsible for this, and the following events lead me to think that the Allies themselves never learned of this act at all. This was only a few minutes into our retreat, but the next events happened with a terrible rapidness. As we all dreaded, the American aircraft appeared from the southwest direction, meaning that the planes could see us behind the hedgerows on our north side. There was nothing we could do about this. Our destination was only a matter of kilometers away, and so the column continued to advance slowly. Hoping for the best as always, I reasoned that our vehicles were so well camouflaged that the aircraft would not notice us. At first, this seemed to be the case, as from this group of about 6 Thunderbolts, 2 flew over us without showing an interest. I am sure I was not the only soldier in that sunken road whose heart beat with relief at seeing this. But then the 3rd and 4th planes dived down to look at us and came racing over the roadway at low altitude, so low that I could see the pilots looking down at us from their bubble canopies. The crews shot up at them with small arms fire, but this had no effect. The entire group of Thunderbolts swung around and attacked us from the north to the south, following along the line of the sunken road, one after the other. The situation was absolutely hopeless for us. I saw the long streaks of white vapor shoot down from under their wings, and there was barely time to take evasive action even if the sides of the road had permitted it. As it was, the vehicles were confined within the road, unable to leave the sunken channel, and the Thunderbolt rocket simply raked along the column while its movement was restricted in this way. I jumped off the deck of the Stug, with the remaining energy given by the amphetamine tablet, and landed on the edge of the embankment under the hedges. I remained there, motionless, and from my prone position I was able to see the effect of the air attack on the entire column, as far as one of the Hanomags at the front, a distance of about 100 meters, until a curve in the road hid the rest of the column from me. The American rockets poured along the column, many of the projectiles striking the fields on either side, and some striking short, exploding among the bodies of the American troops behind us. I saw that these rockets were high explosive, which I had seen used in Italy, and I knew how destructive they could be. I saw the rockets devastate the American corpses, severing their limbs and their heads and throwing the pieces for long distances across the fields in trails of blood and smoking flesh. For this reason I think the air attack destroyed the evidence of the executions, if that is indeed what they were. But other rockets came smashing directly into the German troops and vehicles in the sunken road. I held my hands over my head and looked through the gap between my helmet rim above my eyes and the ground under my chin as these weapons struck. The sunken road was turned into an absolute slaughterhouse by these American projectiles. Their high explosives fell on the Stugs, ripping off the armored screens on their sides and blasting away the foliage they had massed on their top decks. 2 of the Stugs were hit on the engine decks and the engine covers burst open in big spouts of fire. The last Stug, the one reversing with its gun pointing back down the road, was hit somewhere on the upper hull, and I think that the rockets went through the commander's hatch on the top, directly into the crew compartment. This Stug threw itself from side to side, slamming into the embanked walls of the roadway, and I saw that the entire roof of its superstructure was being blown out. I think that all the ammunition inside was exploding because the detonation was enormous, sending pieces of the roof whirling up into the fields. Many pieces of the crew from inside were thrown up also. The whole explosion was a real tornado of bodies and steel, every piece trailing fire and smoke as it fell to earth. This was not the end. The rockets struck along the sunken road, exploding among the SS boys who were hurrying along, desperately looking for cover. The impacts came every second, slaughtering these boys as they ran or dived on the ground. The rocket explosions ripped up the sunken track, and the high walls on either side deflected the shrapnel and debris back again, so that the path was full of bouncing, shrieking metal. I saw a group of half a dozen of these SS troops torn into pieces, with their innards ripped out and their empty bodies left burning in the road. A few of them, further ahead, ran forward to escape the carnage, but in front of them one of the Hanomags was hit by a rocket, and, whether by accident or some action by the driver, it began to reverse and back onto the SS troops behind it. This Hanomag was blazing with fire, with all its gasoline flooding out, and it reversed out of control straight into the troops. The boys were flattened by the half-track, run down one after the other. The Hanomag kept reversing and trampling the bodies of the troops until it finally crashed into one of the burning Stugs, where it came to rest. The entire roadway was full of flames, broken bodies, shattered machinery and exploding ammunition. Some of the SS were still alive but on fire, and the ammunition in their pouches was detonating, which was injuring them further. I saw one youth struggle to his feet with his whole body on fire, and then the grenades that he carried tucked into his belt exploded, sending his limbs in different directions. Other troops crawled or dragged themselves, struggling in the pools of burning gasoline until they were enveloped by the fires. I waited for about a minute, then perhaps 2 minutes, and then for a longer time, but I don't know how long exactly. I heard the American aircraft flying off to the north, and I must say that my chest was heaving very hard, making my torso rise and fall on the ground under the hedgerow. I was at a loss about what to do. I was in a state of absolute confusion. I was also hit in the back by debris, and this made it difficult for me to breathe. I had been through a series of battles that day. First, the initial Tobruk fight, then the second bunker line, and now this attack on the column. Each time the German forces were overwhelmed by vast superiority of numbers and weaponry, especially in artillery and attack from the air. I had a feeling of great despair, doubting that we could ever resist this enemy that had such machines and such resources. I was in a bad condition, physically and psychologically. Also, the morphine and amphetamine were wearing off, leaving me weakened and confused. The pain in my back, my chest and my leg was very severe. I struggled with myself to decide what to do. Part of me wanted to surrender and give up the fight. But another side of my mind said that to give up now was meaningless after so much effort, especially when I was close to the next line of defense. In the end, I slid down into the sunken road and made my way along its length, intending to reach our next positions. A few other survivors were doing likewise, and we had to climb over the many shattered corpses in this roadway, with many severed limbs and heads strewn around among the burning vehicles. In some cases, the fallen men were still alive and panting or groaning miserably, and this sound was added to the crackle of the flames. Nothing was done to help these wounded men. We had no morphine or bandages, and the wounded men needed doctors, nurses and medical equipment. I myself had severe difficulty just walking, and my breathing was very painful, so I could not carry any of them. One of these wounded was hit especially badly, with much of his stomach hanging out into the road, but he was still conscious and moving his hands. After I stepped over him, I heard a shot behind me, and I saw that one of the other survivors had put him out of his suffering with a single bullet to the head. That was a merciful thing to do in these circumstances. Finally, we left the destroyed column behind, and we reached the fortified line that we were aiming for. This was a strong point of bunkers with pack guns, and it was organized much like the previous one that we had just seen destroyed by the American aircraft. There I was seen by a medic who said I had several broken ribs, and I was sent to the rear behind our lines in a horse-drawn cart which was being used to transport the wounded. I was the least wounded man in that cart. The others had lost ears, hands or eyes. Many were burned, with their scalps gone or their charred uniforms stuck to their damaged skin. I felt guilty, in my eyes being only lightly wounded. This was not the end of my war. I was given several weeks recuperation at a field hospital in the south of our area of operations. Although being among the able-bodied patients, I was also tasked with field stripping and repairing rifles and machine guns that were jammed or damaged in some way. This was light work and I found that it kept my mind occupied. I had many unwanted memories of my experiences on June 6, which prevented me sleeping and affected my concentration. In the field hospital we followed the progress of the invasion and our defense in as much detail as possible. The mood of us recuperating men was quite pessimistic, as we had all seen the enormous power of the weapons that the Allies used and their superiority in the air. As we became aware that the beachheads were linking up, and then the Cherbourg Peninsula was cut off from our forces, most of us began to accept that the Allies would create a permanent occupied zone in France. Some of us said that this could be contained and it would allow our forces to grind down and destroy the enemy forces over time, preventing them from attacking us further. But most of the men did not believe that the pocket could be contained for long, and that if the Allies broke out and spread across the eastern plain they would surround Paris quickly. This turned out to be an accurate prediction of what eventually happened. In July I rejoined the division, which was reorganizing a lot of the men who had retreated from the coast in the first days of the invasion. My role was as a transport driver of an Opel Blitz truck carrying ammunition and grenades. However, I was taken prisoner in late July when the Americans overran our rear echelon areas quite rapidly. We were ordered to fight, but we had rifles and grenades against groups of Shermans and we surrendered willingly. After surrendering, we were kept in a prison compound near the coast. There were about 2,000 Germans and other nations in this camp. Everybody was in there. Officers, foot soldiers, marine troops, panzer crews and Luftwaffe mechanics. The Americans took little interest in us and allowed us to organize the camp as we wished. Being a prisoner of war with the Americans was quite eye-opening. Even those of us who believed that the Allies could be thrown out of France fell silent when we saw the way the Americans were organized, and the resources they had to work with. Their planes were constantly in the sky. Everything was mechanized, all supplies were carried by truck or train with seemingly no concern over the amount of fuel used. If a jeep or a truck broke down, it was neglected rather than repaired and a fresh one was used, still shiny from the factory. Instead of using local food, they ate from tins and cans of food that were made in America. We found this fascinating and we formed an impression of an unstoppable power that would simply roll over any obstacle. And this is what eventually happened, as we now know, both in France and in Germany. Epilogue. Unfortunately, I was unable to find out what happened to Stefan later in his life. His unit, the 919th Grenadier Regiment, suffered heavy losses during the invasion. They were cut off from supply lines and at some point had to hold out and fight without food for 3 days. The regiment later fought at Cherbourg, where it surrendered on June 26, 1944.